everybody for joining us today. This is a learning series that the Transaction Support Centre, the Tenure Support Centre, as we're now calling it, has put together to really share experience and practice on how to deal with the tenure situations of households, low-income households. The work of the TSC, I think many of you would be familiar with, and at the end of the presentation is the link to the website, and there's also a Facebook page. There's a WhatsApp group or a WhatsApp communication channel as well. So there's lots of ways of getting connected. And I'm here today with Lisa Hutzebut and Jess Breyer from the Transaction Support Centre and 71.4. My name is Casey Arrest. I'm with the Centre for Affordable Housing Finance, and we're delighted to offer this series so that we can both share what we've learned and then hear from you about the particular challenges that you're having in dealing with tenure issues at the local level, as well as at the policy level. So our questions go in both directions, quite practically towards how to deal with specific cases and help individuals, and then also more broadly around the policy implications of this and how that might feed through into both the municipal, the provincial, and the national policy discussions, whether that's in human settlements or also in other departments, because of course other departments relate to this issue as well. So let me hand over to Lisa, and you can take it away. I'm really interested in hearing about this topic.
Thanks, Kezia. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for your interest in today's session. Just before we kick off, is there anybody in the meeting who's not familiar with the TSC and the work that we do? Because if everybody's familiar with us, I'll skip the background of the TSC itself.
Thanks, Shay. I'm not familiar with the TSC.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I'll give a quick overview then. Jess, could you move on to the next slide? Okay, so the Tenure Support Centre was set up in 2018 in Makaza, in Khayelitsha, in Cape Town. And it's a pilot action research initiative between, as Casey mentioned, the Centre for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa and 71.4. And we initially set ourselves up with the view to primarily looking at the resale market in these kind of areas. But when we opened our doors, we very quickly saw that there was a myriad of other title deed, tenure issues in these markets that people were coming in and asking us about. And we very quickly realized that actually we could offer a far more holistic service. And so our work has morphed into looking at resales in this market, but also looking at informal cash sales, how we can regularize those after they've already happened. Lots of deceased estates, so how we can get dead capital out of deceased estates and into the hands of heirs. And then we've also done a lot of work primarily with the City of Cape Town through in the primary transfer backlog space. So subsidized housing that is stuck and is not yet been transferred to beneficiaries for various reasons. So that's in a nutshell what we do. And we've seen many clients to date. Just on the non-primary transfer side, we've seen almost 800 clients that we've helped with various issues in that space. So that's pretty much what we do. Jess, you can move on to the next slide. So the TSC was involved in putting together what we call the Primary Transfer Toolkit. And it's a very practical, we believe, a very practical toolkit for looking at how you can unblock some of the blockages with primary transfers. It has two sections. It has the Land Rights Toolkit and it has the Beneficiary Administration Toolkit. The Land Rights Toolkit was put together primarily by GeoAfrica, Peter Hoffman and Chris Carter, and it looks at the blockages around your land. So problems with registrations of your general plans, problems with encroachments, problems with Basically anything that's happening on the land that doesn't yet allow those urban to become transferable. That's not what we're going to be focusing on today. I know that there's a lot of housing authorities that have come to us and said, well, actually, my predominant problem lies in Section 1. But that's a discussion for another day. What we're going to look at is a part of Section 2. So the Beneficiary Administration Toolkit basically says, once your urban are ready to be transferred, you now sit in your beneficiary space. So you sit in the space where I cannot transfer to my beneficiary because of, and it can be a whole host of reasons. They're deceased, I can't find them, they've sold the property, they've got married, they've got divorced, etc., etc. So Jess, if you just pop onto the next slide for me, you'll see a snapshot of the toolkit itself. You can see there is the link there at the top, which we would love you to have a look at and play around on. It's a very user-friendly toolkit. You'll see down the left-hand side, there's a whole lot of sections you can click on. And each of those sections under that categorization takes a specific primary transfer problem on the beneficiary side, and it unpacks a process and a solution on how we believe that that can be solved. And they are very straightforward. It's very easy to use. So yes, we would encourage everybody to play around on that if you are interested in having a look at that. And please giving us feedback if it's something that you think you might be able to use, or something that you think you might not be able to use, and why, so that we can, keep that toolkit as something that is actually of benefit to people. Okay, so if you can move on for me, please, Jess. The section that we're going to look at today is informal sales. So our last session was on deceased estates. Today, we're going to look primarily at informal sales. And before we get into informal sales, I just wanted to take a quick sidestep into Section 10A of the Housing Act. So our experience to date with various local authorities that we've dealt with around the country is that we don't like informal sales. We think they're illegal. And Section 10A will basically always trump. So sort of a blanket reliance on Section 10A as the means of making informal sales illegal, and not really being prepared to step into the space of looking at how informal sales can be dealt with. So we don't think it's particularly helpful to say, well, an informal sale is illegal and there's nothing I'm going to do about it because of Section 10A. Just a quick overview of Section 10A. I think we're all familiar with it, but basically it says that a beneficiary, if he wants to sell his subsidy property, must go to the Provincial Department of Human Settlements and ask for permission to sell if it is within the first 8 years from the date that the beneficiary acquired the property. Now, obviously, we know that informal cash sales happen in this market, and we know that they happen completely ignoring Section 10A. And our attitude is, well, those sales have happened. It doesn't make much sense to say, well, I'm going to now go back and say that that sale hasn't happened because it was illegal, and thereby prevent what has actually happened on the ground from ever being regularized. What I want to point out here, and we have quite a clear view on this, is that there's a vast difference between Section 10A in your primary transfer backlog context, as opposed to in another non-primary transfer backlog context. And I want to give you two scenarios here. The first is, let's say, a beneficiary who was approved a subsidy in 2021, given occupation in 2021, and very quickly realizes that somebody in the family has died and they need to sell their property to pay for the funeral. We see that a lot. It's tragic, but we see that a lot. It's the only way they feel they can raise the funds. And so they then come and they say, well, I'm within my 8-year period, please, can you give me approval to sell? So that's the one scenario. The second scenario is somebody who was given occupation, say in 2008, a subsidy was approved in 2008, and through no fault of their own has still not managed to get a title deed to that subsidy house from government for whatever reason. 2008 to 2022, 14 years have run since that person has lived in that house and since that person has had a subsidy approved. And our argument is, well, had the state been able to timeously transfer that property, your 8 years would have long since run. So you cannot penalize people as a result of that failure on the part of the state to pass the primary transfer in the first place. And so what we believe is that you actually need to look at Section 10A in the primary transfer space completely differently. You need to look and you need to say, actually, has that 8 years effectively already run, even though my primary transfer might not yet have registered? So there's a policy here in the Western Cape, and I'm not sure if other provinces have something similar, whereby basically they look at the earlier of date of subsidy approval, date of acquisition of the property, which is really deemed to be the date the sale agreement with the state was signed, and registration of transfer. And they look at the earliest of those dates. And we've actually successfully managed to apply this policy to about, I would say, about 8 or 10 of our cases of informal sales, where we've said, look, although the primary transfer hasn't yet happened, your person has been in occupation for 12 or 14 years, please can you consider giving permission to sell? And that permission has actually been granted. So what we believe is, as a big sort of unblocker of some of the blockages in informal sales with the primary transfer backlog, is to say that where there has been a primary transfer backlog, your waiver of your Section 10 should be automatic. You shouldn't have to go through an application process. You shouldn't have to prove anything. It should be, okay, well, there's been a delay on the part of the state of X years, and you can make that X years whatever is a suitable parameter. Let's say the delay has been 8 years. The moment the delay has been 8 years, you have to give that waiver. So that is something to think about in your spaces as to whether that is something that is acceptable, whether that's possibly a workable solution, because as we've seen, the applying for waivers with informal sales is a huge stumbling block. Okay. All right, I want to move on to, Jess, if you can bring up the next slide. So informal sales, specifically in the primary transfer context. And with the toolkit, we've identified 4 specific scenarios. That's not to say that those are the only scenarios, but there are 4 that we have come across a lot in the work that we do, primarily on a big project we did in Makaza on primary transfers. The first is where your beneficiary is alive and can be contacted and doesn't dispute that a sale took place. So we'll look at that. The second is where your beneficiary is alive and contactable, but disputes the sale. The third is where your beneficiary is alive, but you can't find them or they're not contactable. And then the fourth one is where your beneficiary is deceased, which obviously crosses over the section in the toolkit specifically on deceased estates. It's kind of a hybrid scenario. So let's dive into the first one. Jess, if you can bring up the next slide. Okay. So the toolkit outlines 3 options, 3 possible solutions for your first scenario. So you've got a sale, somebody's saying there's a sale, your beneficiary's alive, you know where he is, you can contact him, and he's not disputing the sale. He's saying, yes, in fact, I did sell that property. And there are actually 3 solutions, which we quite like, because it really gives alternatives to try and fit, we believe, pretty much every informal cash sale in this first category, where your beneficiary is contactable, into one of these solutions. The first solution, and we're going to go into each of them in a lot of detail. The first solution is where you say, okay, I recognize the sale, I transfer from the housing authority to the original beneficiary, and then an on transfer from the original beneficiary to the purchaser. So that's the first solution, and we'll talk about that. The second solution is when you say, actually, let's not do this back-to-back, 2 transfers, one after the other. Let's do a direct transfer from the housing authority to that purchaser. But obviously that means we need a subsidy for that purchaser. So that's the second process. And the third process is, let's say you can't do 1 or 2 because your purchase is a non-qualifier, and then you would look at some sort of regularization. So let's dive into the first one, the back-to-back transfer. Okay, so remember, this is where our beneficiaries are live, we know where they are, and they're not disputing the sale. And we've actually tested this in the city of Cape Town on about, I would say, 6 or 7 back-to-back transfers that we have successfully done. And how this process works is the housing authority basically follows whatever HSS is telling it. There's my beneficiary. I'm going to transfer to my beneficiary. And then there's going to be an immediate transfer on to the person who's bought the property, to the purchaser. So your beneficiary will actually sign 2 sale agreements here. They'll sign the sale agreement with the city or the province or whoever's doing the primary transfer project to get the primary transfer. And then they will also simultaneously sign a sale agreement with the purchaser. So you will have these 2 sale agreements that go together. Obviously, we recognize that it is not the state's responsibility to do the second transfer. It's the state's responsibility to do the primary transfer. And once they've done the primary transfer to the beneficiary, their obligation is really fulfilled. It is then within the realm of the purchaser to then take the signed sale agreement and get that transfer through for its own account, for his or her own account. So there are pros and cons of this process. The first advantage is that you don't need to do anything on HSS. You don't need to apply for any new subsidies. You don't need to fiddle with any of your existing subsidies. You basically just transfer to your beneficiary. A second advantage is that it doesn't prejudice a purchaser who's a non-qualifier. So let's say you didn't have this process, this back-to-back transfer process as an option. And let's say the housing authority's only possible process was to substitute the purchaser as beneficiary. But now you come along and you've got a non-qualifier. This process actually very nicely allows a non-qualifier to still secure transfer of the property to themselves without having to go through a subsidy route. And then the last advantage of this particular process is it also recognizes that your original beneficiary should stay on HSS, should always remain on your subsidy system as having had a subsidy, because he's actually now walked away with a significant amount of cash in many cases by way of the purchase price of that property. So we like the fact that HSS stays as it is, you transfer to beneficiary, beneficiary is shown as having had that property, and then it gets unsold. It very much reflects what's actually happened on the ground. There are unfortunately some drawbacks to this process though, particularly for the purchaser, is that it is more expensive. So as I've already pointed out, your purchaser is the one who's going to have to pay for the transfer from the beneficiary to him or herself. And that can be, as we know, can be a significant cost. I mean, you're looking at in this market anywhere from about 10 to about 15,000 in transfer costs. The work of the TSC, we strip those costs out and we offer it to our clients for a lot less, but it can be a barrier to transfer for the purchaser. They just don't have the money to follow this process. And that's why there are other processes available, which is quite nice because you can kind of look at your specific scenario and see, well, which is the most advantageous for my purchaser? Which one should I choose? And then obviously the big con with this particular process is that you do have to apply for your waiver of Section 10. But as I've already outlined, we believe that were it to be simpler or more automatic in the primary backlog scenario, that would really, I think, alleviate that as a disadvantage to quite a large extent. Okay, so I want to talk you through a case that we've had where we've actually successfully tested this process. So Mrs. M purchased a property in Khayelitsha in 2016 for 165,000 Rand. And the beneficiary, who's obviously also the seller, was actually given occupation of that property in 2008 already, and their subsidy was also approved in 2008. But by 2016, so our 8 years is now actually passed, they're still waiting for transfer of that property from the City of Cape Town. For whatever reason, I mean, actually there I've put the reason, she sold the property because she was a single woman living alone with her children, and she didn't feel safe in the particular area in which the property was located. So she sold the property because she had safety issues, and she actually bought another property in Khayelitsha. So I think what's important, just as a little aside here, is, you know, the narrative we hear over and over again is that people are selling their subsidy properties and moving back to shacks. And that actually hasn't been our experience. Our experience has been people have sold their properties because, primarily actually because they retired to the Eastern Cape. That is, I would say, the biggest reason. But then also because they need money because they can't find employment, or because they need to pay for funerals, or so there are reasons that suggest that this narrative that they're selling properties just to move back to shacks is not actually completely correct. We don't believe. Okay, so this was Mrs. M's scenario. She sold that property. So she bought that property, and that beneficiary then moved on to another property. And Mrs. M now comes to us and says, well, how do I actually secure title? So as part of our work in Makaza, we got the primary transfer through to the beneficiary in 2021. And then we looked at what do we do with Mrs. M now? She actually earns, should we have gone the route of actually rather substituting her as a beneficiary, so rather applying for a subsidy in her name, or should we try this back-to-back back-to-back transfer, which is what we did, because, as you can see there, she earns 23,000 Rand a month. So she would be a non-qualifier, which would mean she would never qualify for a subsidy, and she would have to buy the property from the city. And we didn't think that was really a good solution for her. She's already paid 165,000 Rand for the property. And she's already going to have to pay transfer costs. So let's rather let her do the back-to-back and let's secure title for her that way, which is exactly what we did. And that transfer was registered to her this year. So she now has a title deed. So the pros of that, obviously, she wasn't prejudiced by being a non-qualifier. And also your beneficiary remained on your HSS as showing as having had that subsidy. And we believe that's correct because that beneficiary has received 165,000 Rand for that property. Obviously, the cons were that we did have to go through an actual waiver application, although it was done on the basis of what I discussed earlier, the process through provincial department here, where they do look at the earlier of subsidy approval date, date of acquisition, date of registration. So they did approve the waiver fairly quickly, but it still meant that we had to go through that process. And then obviously the other con for Mrs. M was that she did have to pay transfer costs for that second leg of the back-to-back. But arguably it's still a lot less than what she would have paid had she had to buy the property from the city. Okay, so that is the first scenario. And as I said, it works. We tested it. Let's move on to the second one. So now let's say you have a scenario where back-to-back transfer is not possible. And this is usually because your primary transfer leg is flawed in some way. So your primary transfer from your housing authority to your original beneficiary cannot actually happen. And usually it's because that original beneficiary actually, their subsidy was never actually approved. So they're showing on the system as having applied for the subsidy, but it's either on hold or it's declined, or for some reason in the beneficiary space that initial primary transfer is not possible. So what you can then look at is you can look at whether your purchaser would qualify for a subsidy in her name, which would then allow your housing authority to transfer directly into the purchaser instead of this back-to-back via the beneficiary, the original beneficiary. So a big advantage of this is obviously that there's no cost to your purchaser, because your state is going to transfer directly from state to purchaser as substituted beneficiary. A further advantage is that you're not going to have to apply for Section 10A, right? Because you're not going to have a second sale, which necessitates waiving Section 10A. And then also what's quite nice in this space is, I know through the City of Cape Town, they actually have an enhanced qualification process, whereby because of delays in primary transfer, they recognize that people have built themselves up in the last 10 years since these subsidies were initially approved, and that those income thresholds are actually too low to still be relevant. And so that people who earn up to 15,000 can possibly still qualify for subsidies on this enhanced basis, which just broadens your net of people that you could possibly secure through option 2. Okay. Obviously, the negatives, it's a little bit more admin intense for the housing authority, because you've actually got to do a new subsidy application for your purchaser. And you've actually also got to look at, I've put there as the last disadvantage, your non-approved subsidy beneficiary has now actually received cash for something when they're actually not showing as an approved beneficiary. So we just need to bear in mind that there might be some work to do in that space around making sure that somebody doesn't get the benefit of cash for selling a subsidy property when in actual fact they're still open on the subsidy system. They have never been approved, which means, and never, money's never been paid out on their subsidy, which means the door could be open for them in the future. So we just need to be careful of that. And then what we've also seen is a potential con is that often what happens is, because there's been such a delay between the time the original project was developed and now when you're actually trying to do these primary transfers, is your project is often full. So you then have to apply for further phases on your project. And as we've seen, that can cause significant delay. But it is still an elegant solution. It is still, obviously a much more cost-effective solution. And it is also something that we have just, I would say in the last month, tested in 2 specific cases here in Khayelitsha. So if I give you the case details, Mrs. J, she bought this property in Khayelitsha for 100,000 Rand. So I can't see the date there. It's behind myself. But I think a few years ago for 100,000 Rand. And your beneficiary, or the person who sold it to her, was given occupation in 2008 already. So again, a significant backlog in primary transfer, or a significant lag in primary transfer. But that beneficiary didn't qualify based on income. So at the time that they applied for the subsidy in 2008, they were flagged as being earning too much. And so their subsidy was never approved. So you would never, this is a very nice way of illustrating, you would never in this scenario be able to do your back-to-back, because your beneficiary on your HSS or on your housing authority project lists or whatever is not approved. So that leg is flawed. So we ignore that leg and we say, well, let's apply for a subsidy in the name of Mrs. J directly. So in this scenario, she earned about 12,000 Rand a month. So she qualified on an enhanced basis. We had the subsidy, we applied for the subsidy for her. We had the subsidy approved for her. And that means that the City of Cape Town can now transfer directly to her at no cost to herself. So she's not going to have to pay any transfer costs. And we don't have to apply for a Section 10A waiver. And that matter is in fact already sitting with conveyancers. So she should hopefully be able to secure her title within the next month or 2. So just an illustration of how well and how easy that process can work. The disadvantage, as I've touched on earlier, is that obviously your beneficiary is now walking away with 100,000 Rand, but is not actually an approved beneficiary on HSS. So one must just be very cautious that that person doesn't kind of get off scot-free plus cash, if that makes sense. Okay, and then the third option, Jess, we can move on to the next one, is where you're still in the space where your beneficiary is alive and you know where they are and you can contact them and they don't dispute the sale. But for some reason, you cannot go with either of the two scenarios that I've just outlined. So you can't do a back-to-back transfer, nor can you apply for a subsidy directly in the name of the purchaser. So for example, let's say you wanted to try and do a back-to-back, but you can't get your Section 10A rights waived. Without that, you will obviously never be able to do the second leg of the transfer. Or let's say the purchaser is just simply a non-qualifier. So you cannot use one of the first two processes. So you're going to have to follow a regularization process. And here in the City of Cape Town as well, there is a policy which basically sets out that that purchaser will then have to buy the property from the Housing Authority and will obviously also have to pay transfer costs, because the state's view is we're not going to subsidize the transfer of a subsidized property. We're not going to pay those costs for you when actually you don't qualify. We like the idea, so we've got a couple of non-qualifiers and we haven't gotten very far with them, quite simply, I think, because there is some uncertainty into how to actually apply the regularization policy. We would like to see a set amount. So for this project, if you're a non-qualifier and you need to buy in, it's 15,000. We believe that's the simplest. We believe that will achieve the most regularization, rather than on any kind of means basis or any kind of income basis, because then what we find is it just delays. Nobody knows how to apply it. Nobody knows how to make the call. So we believe if you have one project-based price, and that is what you can buy in it. Okay, so obviously the significant cons of this particular process. So unfortunately, I'm a purchaser and I don't qualify and I can't do a back-to-back, is that it's going to cost me. I'm going to have to pay the city or the province or whoever developed the property, and I'm also going to have to pay my own transfer costs. And the other con about this is that it obviously prejudices your purchasers who bought a property in good faith, weren't aware of what was going on in the beneficiary administration behind the scenes, and now have to come along and actually pay again for the property. Essentially, we're asking them to buy it again. So we have a couple, in my case that illustrates this point is Mr. and Mrs. N. They bought a property in Khayelitsha in 2014 for 130,000. And that beneficiary again was given occupation in about 2008, but is still waiting for the primary transfer to happen. And that property was actually sold because that beneficiary had actually passed away. So his family came along and sold it. We're now we've got 1 foot here in the beneficiary alive and contactable and 1 foot in the beneficiary actually deceased. And that's fine. I want to use this as an illustration of how layered these kind of complications are. You don't ever have, or you very seldom have, a case that fits nicely and neatly into a box. There's always layers that you have to unpick and say, okay, well, can I fit it into that process? Yes, but now I get to that stumbling block. Okay, let me fit it into this process. So what we did in this case, we couldn't do a normal back-to-back. And the reason we couldn't do a normal back-to-back is because we couldn't report the estate. I won't go into the reasons for that because I'll actually touch on it later when we get to the deceased beneficiaries. But we couldn't report the estate, which means the city could never or can never transfer the primary transfer to the estate. And so for that reason, you'll never get that primary transfer through to the original beneficiary, meaning you'll never be able to do the back-to-back onto the purchaser. So that wasn't a solution. The second scenario of applying for a subsidy directly in the name of Mr. and Mrs. N also didn't work because they earn too much. I think they earn around 30,000 combined household income at the moment. So they definitely are non-qualifiers. So the only other option here is you're going to have to regularize. So it's the nice thing about this process is it is a solution for people who can't work with one or two. It also doesn't need a waiver of Section 10A, so you don't have to go through the faff of that process. But obviously for Mr. and Mrs. N, it maybe doesn't feel completely fair. They've paid 130,000 Rand for a property, and the city is now saying to them, that's fine, but you're going to have to pay us again, and you're going to have to pay your own transfer costs. So I've put in that little dotted block at the bottom that we believe that what would be useful in this space is to have that a housing authority actually has like a review panel, which can look at the specific circumstances of a purchaser. So although I said we like the idea of having one price, so you set your price for this project and you say it's going to cost you 15,000 Rand to buy, we do believe that there might be some room or some scope to look at that based on a couple of things. So I've said, for this example of Mr. and Mrs. N, look, they've already paid a significant amount. They've paid 130 already. It's not like they've paid 10 or 15 or 20. They've paid a significant amount for the property. But let's also look at their income. I mean, the income is in this market very, very high, 30,000 Rand a month. And let's also look at their ability to access funding. I mean, at that income level, the chances of them being able to secure a 15,000 Rand loan are very high. I mean, it's very likely that they would get some kind of funding. So perhaps in that scenario, you say, no, actually, that's fine. They should regularize. They should pay the 15,000. They shouldn't be offered any kind of a rebate. But that would look very different if you had somebody, say, who had maybe paid even more. Let's say somebody had paid 200,000 Rand for a property and is only earning just over the threshold, let's say 16,000 a month. Maybe that scenario is a little bit different, and maybe there is some leeway to work on your purchase price. Okay. All right, let's move on to the next one. Is there anything in the, I see there's things happening in the chat. Is there anything that I need to touch on now?
No, Lisa, I think it's fine. Just a little bit of commentary, no big question.
Right. Thank you. So we've touched there on your scenario where you've got no dispute. Nobody disputes the sale. Everyone agrees the sale took place. Your beneficiary is available to cooperate in certain scenarios. And we've looked at the 3 options we believe are very effective in securing that transfer. The second scenario is a little bit different. It's where your beneficiary is alive. You know they're alive. You actually know where they are. They're contactable, but they are disputing the sale. So in this scenario, we believe your housing authority has got to come in and adjudicate. We don't believe it's good enough to say, oh, well, then you guys have a dispute, go and sort it out and come back to us when you've sorted out the sale, because we found that unfortunately, people don't have the resources, they don't have the understanding on what is needed in order to resolve that dispute. And we have tried various things over the course of the last 4 years of our work. We've tried referring them to mediators. We've tried referring them to the magistrates' courts who have dispute resolution departments. We've tried doing in-house, sort of very informal dispute resolution. And unfortunately, none of those have actually achieved anything. And so we believe the housing authority must have its own process. If you have a look at the toolkit, there is a whole section on dispute resolution, and it sets out very nicely, and it's based primarily on the process the City of Cape Town uses here. It's a very simple process. You basically notify your parties that you're going to have this meeting. You call your two disputing parties. We're going to have this meeting. Please bring all your evidence of the sale or of what you say was not the sale. So whether that's an affidavit, whether that's an affidavit from a witness, whether that's a Sanco street committee letter, it might even be an actual signed sale agreement. It might be proof of payment of funds. So whatever evidence you have, please bring it and please come to this meeting. And what's very important in a dispute resolution process is to actually stipulate that if you don't come to the meeting, that the housing authority is actually going to adjudicate in your absence. We have a case in Dunoon here in Cape Town where we have been trying for, I don't know, maybe 2 years to get one of the disputing parties to provide documents it actually involves the deceased estate, so to actually cooperate with the deceased estate process, and they just don't, because it's not in their interests to do so. So there's got to be a very clear message in that conciliation note, in that meeting notice. If you don't come, we're going to adjudicate without you. And then your meeting is held, and your housing authority basically looks at all the evidence. It can listen to the parties, it can look at the documents, and it basically makes a decision based on the evidence. Just before we get to that dotted block at the bottom, we had a case, this is the Stanoon case, where Mr. N was an approved beneficiary for a property. Now, I think this might actually be a CAHF property. He was given occupation in 2008 and is still waiting for the primary transfer, but he sold the property to a couple and actually signed a sale agreement. So there is a signed sale agreement on file, but for whatever reason, he has now decided, and usually the reason is, well, I now want more money. You know, I'm going to dispute the sale and say, well, if you want me to cooperate, you're going to have to pay me more money. But there is in actual fact a signed sale agreement on file. And we packaged this and sent this to the City of Cape Town for them to adjudicate on. And that adjudication was held on the 8th of September. And the decision that the city made was, so it met with the parties, they all presented their evidence, and it decided to do a back-to-back transfer. So they would transfer to the original beneficiary, and this was primarily because, only because your purchasers didn't qualify. So they will do a back-to-back, and then the purchaser is responsible for the on-transfer to themselves in terms of that second deed of sale. So a very nice, elegant solution. And we have another one, the Danoon one, which is currently with the city for adjudication at the moment. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that one, whether the city chooses the same process or whether it chooses a slightly different process, one of the ones I've already outlined. Just a note here that where your identified owner, meaning your person that your city has adjudicated should get ownership at the end of the day, where they are not actually already in occupation. And we see this a lot. So let's say you've got a disputed sale, your original beneficiary has actually leased the property out to somebody else. And your purchaser is now coming along and saying, but actually I bought it and I want transfer. Even if your housing authority adjudicates and says, I'm going to transfer the property back to beneficiary and on to purchaser, the fact is there's another occupant, and that is not the housing authority's responsibility. Okay, they're not obliged to say, if I give you this adjudication letter and I say that you're entitled to ownership at the end of the day, it's not the city's responsibility to evict that person. That will always be the eventual property owner's obligation. Okay, it's just an important note so that you realize that's not your responsibility. Okay, and then the third scenario. So now we've got a beneficiary. He is alive. We can see he's alive, but we don't know how to find him. So this is by far in the work we do, the biggest stumbling block of stuck transactions. We know the beneficiary is alive. We've got evidence of a sale. Previously, maybe the beneficiary said, oh, yes, of course, I'll cooperate. Maybe even signed some of the documents initially with us, but has now disappeared and we cannot find them. So obviously, none of the previous scenarios that we've discussed are possible. We can't do a back-to-back. Because obviously you need that original beneficiary to take your primary transfer from your city. And so basically what we're saying in this case is, well, let's look at either a direct transfer to the purchaser if they qualify, or regularization if they don't. So I'm not going to go through those two scenarios again, because obviously we've just discussed them. But so exactly what we've just discussed on direct subsidies for your purchases or regularization in the space where you know where your beneficiary is, exactly the same is possible in the space where you don't know where your beneficiary is or you can't contact them. I've put a block on the side here, and there is a whole section in our toolkit on locating missing beneficiaries. So we believe that your housing authority has an obligation to try and contact a beneficiary and to try and verify whether an informal sale took place or not. We don't believe it's good enough to say, okay, well, we don't like sales and we're not going to look at sales. We're only going to look at our original beneficiary. We don't find that particularly helpful. So we do believe that there is an obligation to try and find that beneficiary, and there's lots of options for trying to find the beneficiary. So there might be contact details on the original occupancy survey that possibly the housing authority can use to try and contact that beneficiary. Primarily the way we trace beneficiaries or sellers in our space is through the credit bureaus. So you type in the ID number and it will bring up a list of previous telephone numbers, previous addresses, etc., as a way of contacting them. And actually, we've had quite a lot of success in then contacting sellers and saying, this is who we are, this is what we're trying to do. And they then come to the party and agree to regularize the sale with us. There's also potential scope for local authorities to trace, or for province to trace through other scenarios, through other mechanisms, for example, through banks, through SASSA. There are other data sets that could potentially be made available to housing authorities as a way of tracing people. And then if none of those are successful, one could always advertise. So advertise, whether that's on social media, whether that's in a newspaper, whether that's on the radio, whether that's up in a community, a public community space, to call for these beneficiaries to come forward and actually just either confirm the sale or dispute the sale, so that we know how we categorize going forward. So if you, as the local authority, do this process of trying to locate your beneficiaries and it's successful, well, then you can very easily categorize. So you find the beneficiary, they say, yes, I completely agree with the sale. And then you look at the scenarios of this particular case and you say, should we do a back-to-back? Shall we substitute the purchaser's beneficiary, or will it have to be a regularization? If you can't find your original beneficiary, we believe that it is incumbent on the housing authority to actually make a decision based on the available evidence. So even though you can't contact your beneficiary, you've tried to contact them, you've tried to trace them, whatever you've done in that space, you're sitting with a purchaser who actually has a signed sale agreement, or who actually has a street committee affidavit with witnesses who can attest to the sale. We believe it's incumbent on the housing authority to actually make a call based on that evidence, instead of saying, I can't find my beneficiary, I can never formalize transfer. Okay. All right, I'm moving quite quickly. I hope I'm not moving too quickly, but this is the last scenario that we need to discuss, which is where your beneficiary is not alive, not contactable, and is in actual fact you've established deceased. Okay, so exactly as we've discussed on the previous slide, all of your scenarios where your beneficiary is alive and contactable can also be applied where your beneficiary is deceased. Okay, so you could either do a back-to-back transfer from your housing authority. It wouldn't be to your beneficiary in this instance, it would be to your beneficiary's estate. And we do discuss that in quite a lot of detail in our toolkit under deceased transfers. So I put the link there at the bottom. There's a lot of information on transfers to estate late. So that's the first option. You could do a back-to-back housing authority to estate late and estate late onto purchaser. Quite possible, and we've done that ourselves, I think, on 2 or 3 cases. Alternatively, you could apply for a subsidy directly in the name of your purchaser, which then completely skips out the estate process. You wouldn't have to fiddle around with deceased estates at all. So in the deceased estate scenario, the second option here is by far preferable. It's quicker, it's cheaper, you don't rely on the master for anything. You just substitute your beneficiary. And thirdly, again, if your purchaser doesn't qualify, you could follow a regularization policy in this space as well. So I've got a lovely case to discuss with you because it's a hybrid of a primary transfer backlog with a deceased estate with an informal cash sale. So really all the possible layers you can have layered on top of one another. So Mr. K is an approved subsidy beneficiary for property in Khayelitsha, and he was approved on the basis of single with dependents. So I can see on his subsidy application, he has 1 dependent listed. And that's the basis on which his subsidy is approved. He then sells the property in 2014 to Mr. and Mrs. N for 130,000 Rand. And then he unfortunately passes away. So Mr. and Mrs. N approach us and they say, well, what can we do? So we look at those three scenarios down the left-hand side and we say, well, can we do a back-to-back? So in order to do a back-to-back, we'd have to report to the estate. We'd have to get master's letters issued so that the city can transfer directly into the name of the estate, and we will then pick up the second leg into the name of the purchaser. Unfortunately, in this scenario, that is an impossible, that solution cannot work. And the reason it cannot work is when we tried to report to the estate. So we did all the work in getting the estate documents together, reporting the estate at the master. And we were told that Mr. K, so he was unmarried. He didn't have any children of his own. His parents were deceased, meaning his actual heir, his only heir, is his brother. So we reported the estate in that way to say that the only heir of the deceased is the brother. And the master actually picked up on the subsidy application that Mr. K had put this person as dependent. So we went back to the family and we said, well, who is this dependent on the subsidy application? Because the master is now thinking, well, if you have a dependent on a subsidy application, surely he's your child. And then nobody in the family knows who the subsidy beneficiary is. So we can't show the master who the subsidy beneficiary is. We can't explain it. We can't give any kind of meaningful resolution to the master to say, actually, what we've submitted to you is correct. There are no children. So the master will not issue master's letters of authority, which means we can never proceed with an estate transfer. So we then looked at the second scenario and we said, well, can we apply for a subsidy for Mr. and Mrs. N directly in their name and rather do that? So the deceased estate process is not working. Let's put that to one side. We looked at their income and unfortunately their combined household income is 30,000 Rand a month. So they definitely don't qualify for a subsidy. So the only solution for them, unfortunately, is to regularize, which means they will have to buy the property from the city and they will also have to pay their transfer costs. So that's an unfortunate outcome for them when you have other scenarios which could potentially have worked if your facts had been a little bit different. Okay, I think that's it from me in terms of a discussion of all the options in the toolkit and the sort of cases that we've seen that we've worked through those solutions. Are there any questions on informal sales generally or on specific cases that you might have in your areas?
Lisa, Zingisa mentioned in the chat that scenario 3, deceased beneficiaries, is the most common. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's something to emphasize. I think as she put that in, you had emphasized it about how to, or sorry, the people that you can't find, the beneficiaries you can't find. Mm-hmm. And then you went through the processes about how to find such beneficiaries. It does take the official a little bit beyond what they imagined their scope to be and to engage.
I think that's true. Yes, yeah. I think that is true. But I think what is the alternative? The alternative is you say, well, I feel it's beyond my scope. So therefore this gets stuck here. There's nothing I can do with it, which is obviously not very helpful, to anybody. So I think there is that obligation. I suppose for each local authority or for each department, maybe what that scope of that obligation is might look a little bit different.
Yeah.
So Lisa, do you want to? I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Lisa and Kezia. I think you did cover me on that part, on scenario number 3, but I also liked the idea of having housing authorities involved in dispute resolutions, because when provinces and metro report back to us of non-performance on the delivery of title deeds, they don't go into detail as to what steps have they taken to make sure that those disputes are resolved. or even provide us a brief of how far they are with the dispute resolutions. So as opposed to them just taking a back seat and saying there's a dispute and not try to be involved in resolving that dispute, I think that's a point to take home. Thanks.
Excellent. You'll have a look, Singisa. If you look at the toolkit, you'll actually see we've put, I think it's under resources. There's a section quite near the end. We've actually put example documents that could be used, that could be adapted for use by a dispute board or panel or whatever, because it's very important, you know, if your housing authority is going to adjudicate on a dispute, that you try and use that opportunity to tick as many boxes as you can right then and there at that meeting. So here's an example of a sale agreement. Get the sale agreement signed while they're there. Here's an example of an adjudication award letter. So use this letter, adapt it for your specific scenario, and actually issue the award letter right then and there to the parties, so that when you leave that meeting, you are actually already in a position of being able to move to transfer, rather than leaving the meeting with a decision which actually then still needs to be acted on, you know, still needs to be put together, if it makes sense what I'm saying.
It totally does, Lisa.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Are there any other questions?
We did have a couple more people join us in the course of the session. It would also be good to hear, you know, if any of these cases resonated with ones that you're dealing with directly, or do you have other variations? I'm sure you do. And then I think your last question there, Lisa, for future learning sessions, what topics would be useful to explore?
Yeah, I mean, I say this every time, but you know, obviously our experience is based on our experience, and we're very mindful of the fact that there might be completely different challenges in other local authorities or in other provinces. And we believe that we can, you know, we can assist in engineering these kinds of solutions for, we like to think, pretty much any scenario. But we obviously can't do that unless we know what your challenges are. So yes, please feel free to send them or email them to us so that we can have a look at that.
It might be interesting to have a session on, if it's possible, if there's any blanket action that can be done that deals with groups, and ways in which maybe we should think about that a little bit, so that we can start to narrow down the cases that, or clarify before they come and present themselves, the individual beneficiary cases. So like, for example, the beneficiary, the occupancy survey and how to do that. So that might be something that would be interesting to look at as well. Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of time. If there aren't any other questions from colleagues, last chance. Okay, Lisa.
Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation today. I hope it was useful. Yeah, and we look forward to your comments on things you might need in the future, things we can do for the next presentation.
I see your contact details are right there, so people can contact you directly, which is lovely. And then we'll have another session of these in a couple weeks' time, and we'll announce. But it would be really nice if all of you could assist and in sharing this with colleagues, so that they might also join and we could generate some discussion, because I think that's what would give sort of a more direct resonance in terms of the cases you're dealing with yourselves. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Lisa. Thank you, Jess, in the background there.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Kezia. Yeah, and I'll send everyone an email with the link to the presentation. Okay.
Great, good.
Thanks, colleagues. I'm typing my email address on the chat because I got the meeting link to my boss since she couldn't attend. Can you please include my email on the next invite? Thanks.
Yes, sure. Will do, Zingisa. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.